Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine around the world. Today is Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Stephen Moore, who is a former chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives and founder of the NGO, the Ukraine Freedom Project. Welcome, Stephen. How are you?
Great to be with you, my friend.
Thank you so much for joining us today. To start off with, can we get some information about your professional career?
Yeah, sure. I have been working in Republican politics all my life. I've ran a ton of Republican campaigns. I'm pretty good at it. At least I thought I was pretty good at it until I saw what the Russians do. Those guys spend $2 billion annually on in getting their message out. So it's a little bit that's you got to be really smart to try to push against that. Uh, so but I've run Republican campaigns for much of my life. I've worked on Capitol Hill for about 7 years as the chief of staff to a member of leadership, the number four guy in the House of Representatives, for about 7 years, and then spent a year in Ukraine in 2018, 2019, and loved it. For obvious reasons, you know why. The people there are entrepreneurial, they're creative, they're hardworking, and what we found out in this war is that they love freedom more than anything else, and they will fight to the death to maintain their freedom. So that's just is amazing to me. Um, and after I left Ukraine the first time, 2018, 2019, I got a job at an AI company. It's an American AI company that had like 500 Ukrainian employees. So I made a bunch of Ukrainian friends, and then I left that company on January 31st, 2022. And I was struggling with really weighty issues in life, like, do I spend the rest of the winter skiing in the Alps or skiing in the Rockies? Started hearing from my Ukrainian friends, and they were saying things like, they're bombing Kyiv. I don't know what to do. And I had spent nearly 2 years in Iraq at the beginning of that war. And Ukraine is my fifth war zone, six if you include Congress. So I felt like I knew what to do to help. And so I hopped on a plane and arrived in Ukraine at day five of the war. That's a brief history of Stephen Moore.
Stephen, why did you decide to go to Ukraine in 2018, 2019? Number one. And number two, are you still currently living in Ukraine?
Yeah, I live in Ukraine. I live in Kyiv. I have an apartment in Kyiv, although I spend a lot of time now in Washington, D.C., because I think that's where I can be most useful. But yeah, I consider Kyiv my home.
And when was your NGO, the Ukraine Freedom Project, founded? And what does it do?
So, as I said, I kind of showed up at the Romanian border with Ukraine on day five of the war and just started trying to help. And I started buying medical supplies and that sort of thing. And initially, I wasn't talking to any media because I thought it would really impede my ability to operate. But you know what really impedes your ability to operate? Not having any money. And so I started the Ukraine Freedom Project so I could raise money for my friends and family, and we've raised quite a bit of money, and we've gotten a couple of $1 million here and there, thereabouts of non-lethal aid to the military and aid to Ukrainians in areas impacted by the war. And what I ultimately did after that first year was I figured out that my friends, conservatives, Republicans, Christians in America were not seeing the things that I saw in Ukraine. In fact, they would argue with me about what I was seeing, because Russian propaganda is just that powerful. And so I decided that probably rather than schlep another box of food to Donetsk Oblast, I would just start talking to people in America about what I was seeing. And so that's what we're doing now. We're pushing back every day on Russian propaganda in the conservative ecosphere.
And please tell us about your efforts to convince U.S. conservatives to support Ukraine. And do you think your message is having a positive effect on them?
Yeah, if your listeners are interested, they can go see. I had a in November. I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal talking about the resurgence of Republican support for Ukraine. At that time, it was the Republican support was the highest it had been since the fall of 2023, and and so part of what that is yeah. Let me sort of this is I'll give you a little bit of an anecdote here. I have a friend, Victor, and one day this guy comes up to me. I'm in a WeWork type facility, a co-working facility in Kiev, and he says, "Hi, my name is Victor. I'm an evangelical Christian." All right, dude. Nobody introduces themselves to me that way, and I'm like, okay, what you got? And he starts telling me the story of him as a volunteer in Luhansk, who was getting people out of Luhansk when in 2014. One day he was taking a group that included a pregnant woman and a newborn infant, and the Russians pulled him over, pulled him out of his truck, and took him to the basement. And listen, I don't need to tell you or anyone listening to this podcast what that means. You're being taken to the basement is a euphemism for torture. And so he was in the basement for 25 days, including one day when a Russian Orthodox priest was walking by his cell and heard him praying with his cellmate, which happened to be a Baptist. And so they were praying, and the Russian Orthodox priest looks at Victor, says, "You're not Orthodox, are you?" And Victor, as we have learned, is very forward about his faith. And he says, "No, I'm an evangelical Christian." So they took him from his cell, took him to the torture room, strapped him to a chair, and tased him with electricity while the Russian Orthodox priest tried to cast demons out of him for being an evangelical Christian. I see you shaking your head because you're just blown away by this information like I was, and so and shortly thereafter I heard Tucker Carlson tell people on his show that Zelensky's persecuted Christians. And I'm looking around, I live in Kiev, I'm like, I'm just not seeing that. So I'm a Christian. I grew up in an evangelical Christian household, and I just thought, man, if my friends back in Tulsa, Oklahoma knew about this, it would shatter their other conceptions about Ukraine. And so I started telling people.
And when did you first begin that campaign with American Christians, telling them about Russian torturing and murdering Ukrainian Christians in occupied Ukraine?
Yeah, and that was starting in the summer of 2023. Anna Shvetsova, who's the chief operating officer of the Ukrainian Freedom Project, she and I recorded Victor's testimony on my iPhone, and we took it to Capitol Hill offices and hit like, I don't know. I mean, by the time we are done, we hit like 120 offices. But that first round, we probably hit 10 or 20 Capitol Hill offices, and people were like, "Wow, that's incredible." But if it's true, why is nobody talking about it? And and that's what we had to overcome. And what my I wrote an op-ed, and we shopped it around to different publications. Took us 6 weeks to figure out someone. It was rejected by every major publication in America, and ultimately Providence Magazine, which is a really great piece for Christian foreign policy, really great magazine that publishes Christian foreign policy. They published it, and so then shortly thereafter, Mike Johnson became Speaker of the House. And not many people know how that happened, but Kevin McCarthy was the pro Ukraine Speaker of the House. And you may remember that he was in Israel, and the Russian reporters popped up and said, "Mr. Speaker, now that you're Speaker, when are you going to cut off aid to Ukraine?" And McCarthy's like, "What? No, we're not going to do that. You guys are the problem. Russia's the problem, and so in October 2023, seven pro-Russia members of the Republican Party stood up and said, "We need to vote Kevin McCarthy out of office because he passed a $300 million aid Ukraine bill." Every Democrat in the House of Representatives joined with his seven members of the Republican Party who are pro-Russia and voted out the pro Ukraine Speaker of the House. Then Mike Johnson came in, and everyone was freaked out because Johnson had voted 9 out of 9 possible times against aid to Ukraine. But what we came to know was that Johnson was a Baptist activist prior to joining Congress. And so his faith is very important to him. So we started a campaign. It's called Russia Tortures Christians. And we got that information out on Capitol Hill. When I started that campaign in the summer of 2023, it took me 6 weeks to get anything published on it. By April of 2024, we were in Time Magazine, we were in USA Today, Fox News, we were in Newsmax, we were, Newsweek twice. So we had really ramped up that campaign. We helped bring in Ukrainian Christians who had suffered greatly for their faith. There's a guy named Sergei Hardarzi, whose wife and infant son were killed in a Russian drone attack, and he and his 3-year-old daughter survived it. And 3 weeks after that guy lost half his family, he flew to DC to talk to Speaker Johnson. And Sergei is the unsung hero of Ukraine aid in 2024. That was the campaign we started. And what we've done now is we've kind of taken it to the next level. We have a movie called A Faith Under Siege, and folks can go see it at afaithundersiege.com. 3.4 million Americans have seen this movie now. And it's just the gripping tale of Victor and others like him.
That was my next question. Can you tell us when you did that? I understand you took two 1,500-mile road trips around Ukraine with a documentary film crew. And secondly, can you just give us some highlights of the film and tell us where it's being
Sure.
shown?
Anna and I put everything into the 2024 campaign to get aid to Ukraine passed. And like every single red penny went into this campaign. And so we got done, we were broke. And we just kind of thought, well, our advocacy days are coming to an end. We don't have any money. So hopefully we have enough saved to go to the beach in Indonesia, and spend some time there. And then this guy, Colby Barrett, calls us. Colby is an entrepreneur from Colorado. He's an amazing man, just has done incredible things in life. He is a really interesting, a really big thinker, and he's a devout Christian. So he calls me and he says, "Hey, I'm coming to Ukraine. I want to make a documentary about Ukraine's Christians who have suffered under the Russians." And and I should have asked him like questions, things like, well, Colby, have you ever made a film before? And the answer would have been no. And I would have said, yeah, me neither. But I failed to ask that question and we made the film anyway. And listen, it is a miracle of God. This film has done this well. Two first-time filmmakers, and we've got it. It's been on CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, 6 times. It's been on Newsmax 3 times as recently as last week. The Trinity Broadcasting Network has shown it, did a primetime special on it. And I don't know if you know Angel Studios, but Angel Studios is like Netflix for Christians. They have 2 million conservative Christian subscribers, and they have asked us to make a series for them about our content. So, again, polling shows that about 3.4 million Americans have seen A Faith Under Siege. We've got 9 million views on A Faith Under Siege, and we've got a bunch of other films as well. Like we've got No Priest Left, which is about Catholics, Catholic priests undergoing some of the worst things in the world, like first century Christian sort of stuff. Got a film on Jewish persecution, and all of our properties got about 9 million views. So, and that doesn't include the stuff on Newsmax and CBN, which you can't really quantify. So we have been amazingly successful. And, Colby, like I said, Colby's this guy that he sold this company in the summer of 2024, and gets done with that transaction and picks up the phone and calls me. Hey, I saw the work you're doing. I like it. Let's make a movie.
Stephen,
So,
unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final
ah,
question. Have you had any success convincing Republicans to support Ukraine militarily? And if so, please give some examples.
we would all like President Trump to be more supportive of Ukraine. And I will say that the level of intelligence sharing, as I understand it, has remained the same or stepped up. The Republicans in Congress, I go talk to the Republicans in Congress, and they're like, tell us what we can do to build more support for Ukraine. If you were to put an aid bill for Ukraine through the Congress right now, it would pass probably pretty well. Steve Witkoff is the guy that's negotiating this deal. And I'm sure Steve Witkoff is really good at real estate deals, but this is not a real estate deal. Witkoff has the inability to critically analyze anything coming out of a Russian's mouth. He says, "Oh, Putin's a good guy." So I think when you look at the White House, you've got Steve Witkoff vying with Marco Rubio for Trump's attention. Despite what you hear Marco Rubio say, Rubio is on the right side on this, and he is. And there's just a battle for Trump's attention. Witkoff and Vance on one side, and Rubio on the other. And so, what we're doing is we're building Republican support for Ukraine. And again, we've been quite successful at it. I think that there's two things we're looking at. One is the public opinion of Republicans on one way, and then two, world events. You look at what's happening right now as we speak in Iran. You know why that's happening? Because Russia started the nuclear program with Iran. And you know who else helped it along? Viktor Orban is, he sent $100 million to Iran to help them with their nuclear program. And, Russia, as we all know, has been, that Russia sent something like 15 cargo planes in the last 90 days full of weapons to Iran. And so as these things become apparent, Wyckoff's position of Putin's a nice guy is going to become increasingly ludicrous. So I think that, as Winston Churchill said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else.
Stephen, on that note, we're going to close the interview for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to spend time with you, man. Thanks for having me on. Let's do it again.
Yes, until next time. I have been speaking with Stephen Moore, who is a former chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives and founder of the NGO, the Ukraine Freedom Project. This episode of Krynytsia has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.